World Bank IMF meetings are kicking off in Washington as the world grapples with the sharpest slowdown in economic activity in 80 years, rising inflation, a food and energy crisis, and the war in Ukraine. These compounding crises are threatening livelihoods and taking a toll on the most vulnerable. There is a profound urgency for policymakers, international organizations, and the private sector to take decisive and coordinated action to build resilience in this era of volatility. And we're just getting into a joint seminar which has been themed The Way Forward, addressing multiple crises in an era of volatility. The seminar features David Malpass, who currently serves as president of the World Bank Group, and Kristalina Georgieva, who is the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Kristalina Georgieva is also the first person from an emerging market economy to lead the IMF since its inception in 1944.
This is our curtain raiser. I feel lots of energy from the World Bank, from the IMF staff in terms of tackling the problems, but we have to put it in the context of the severity of the problem. So there's the risk and the real danger of a world recession next year. The advanced economies are slowing in Europe, and so we'll see where it goes into next year. But the currency depreciation means that the debt levels for the developing countries are getting more and more burdensome. The rise in interest rates puts added weight on it, and inflation is still a major problem for everyone, but especially for the poor. So those are all issues. World Bank has a lot of data coming out. We did our poverty report last week for the first time in 2 years, or it's a 2-year cycle. It shows 70 million more in poverty, and also very concerning, a 4% reduction in median income. So as we think about our goal of shared prosperity, it's not happening. There's reversals going on in development. I call it a crisis facing development. One of the things is the advanced economies are taking a lot of the world's capital. That comes in the form of the fiscal deficits, the heavy borrowing by big corporations, and the central banks themselves buying only the bonds of the very advanced countries. And so that puts a strain on development from the macro side. And then, of course, from the individual side, we see the problems of education and energy, shortages of fertilizer and of food crops. So it's a vast array of problems. I hope, and we always talk about solutions, so that's one of the things. I wanted to ask you too, what do you see the forces? And I can talk about things that could be done, but one of our core desires is to see more resources flowing into the developing world. What do you think?
Well, I very much agree with you that the risk of recession has gone up. We have calculated that about 1/3 equivalent of the world economy would have at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth this year, next year, and that the total amount that would be wiped out by the slowdown of the world economy is going to be, between now and 2026, $4 trillion. This is the size of Germany GDP gone. And when we look at the picture, we are asking what are the drivers, and of course what is causing a push of prices, especially energy and food prices, and major disruptions as a result in how economies function. The prices going up, inflation that is stubbornly high, and necessitates tightening of financial conditions that has gone faster than originally anticipated. So when we look at these drivers, then what are the consequences? We are seeing slowdown in all 3 key economies of the world. Eurozone, because primarily of gas prices shooting up. China, because of COVID disruptions and the volatility of the housing sector. We see a very significant problem in China, dragging down growth. And in the United States, still very strong labor market, but also losing a bit of momentum because interest rates are starting to bite. And so when we are in this environment, the question for us this week is, what can be done? What we are advocating for, David, are actions in three areas. First, contain inflation. We cannot afford inflation to be a runaway train. And we are risking, if we don't have strong action for this to happen. But it is a very, very difficult road to navigate, because if you don't do enough, we are in trouble. And of course, inflation is a dramatic tax, especially on the poor people. But if we tighten too much, then the fears of recession will materialize on a large scale. We have to think of the strong dollar that comes with tightening of financial conditions and how it impacts developing countries, and maybe you have some thoughts around that. Secondly, it is painful for people, so some support is necessary, but that support has to be well targeted, because if it is not, then we are adding fuel to the flames of inflation. And that working together, monetary policy, fiscal policy, this year is absolutely paramount. Otherwise, for anybody who is a driver, we would have monetary policy stepping on the brakes and fiscal policy stepping on the accelerator. Not a good ride. And three, and this is where I really want to hear more from you, we have to join forces to help emerging markets and developing economies that are particularly hard hit by tightening of financial conditions. You spoke about capital not being available to help them through, and also to get the big, scary danger of debt crisis under control, because otherwise not only countries affected by it would suffer, the whole world would suffer. So, not a rosy picture, but if we join forces, if we act together, we can reduce the pain that is ahead of us in 2023.
That's right, and it's a global community effort. One of the issues is how to get more production, how to get more growth, and that, I think, has starts normally with advanced economies. They have more capital and the ability to really apply it to various sectors. That will help with inflation, and that's you're exactly right. That's super important. I think markets look ahead. So one of the things is if there can be a concerted effort to describe growth policies going forward, ones that add to supply, then that immediately begins to address some of the concerns about inflation expectations, which are so important to get down. We have to face the starting point that interest rates were probably too low at the beginning of the cycle, substantially too low. So some parts of the world are still getting back to what might be a neutral spot. So getting there quickly is important. And then as we think about then the capital flows, I do think there needs to be a rethinking by the advanced economies of some of the basics. One would be to have debt limits. It's very hard to think of a world growth environment where a certain small group of countries have unlimited amounts of debt that they can issue even during a crisis or apart from a crisis. Because as the governments do that, it takes up the available capital. And then we also have this issue that I mentioned of central banks buying the bonds, which had never been done prior to 2009, the bonds, but only of the advanced economies. And so that creates this bias. There's both a regulatory and a capital bias within the world that works against the developing countries. So that takes me to you're exactly right about the need to keep targeted. If you have subsidies, have them be targeted, because there's only so much fiscal space, fiscal availability. Whether you're in advanced economies or in developing countries, there can't be a subsidy for everybody, because then you quickly run out of money. So as World Bank works hard on individual developing countries, what a primary concept that we're doing is both supporting the emergency situation. For example, we're doing that now with big food programs, but then also trying to help the countries have better policies that that have fewer subsidies for the upper end, and more availability of both financing, inclusive financing for women, for new businesses, and for small businesses within their economies. So that goes almost country by country to have stronger programs that do that. And then we have to work so fast now to create space for the climate problems that are facing many of the developing countries, most.
I want to compliment you and your staff at the bank for two things. One, how quickly you brought forward resources to address the food crisis. The 30 billion that you are making available is going to go a long way to help countries. There are about 48 that are severely impacted by food insecurity. I actually am heartbroken to see the world again witnessing increasing poverty, increasing hunger and malnutrition. At the IMF, we are, I call it the third line of defense. We want to see humanitarian assistance grants. We want to see the World Bank, as you are doing it, be out there. But we are also making funding available for balance of payment needs. We have created a food shock window, so countries that are affected either because they cannot export their food, like Ukraine, or because they cannot import food, like many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, can
this
benefit.
Is food and fertilizer and energy, so it's all hitting the fiscal space.
At the same time.
Any estimates of how much?
For the we are looking at the estimates of the impact. We took specifically to heart the issue of food. Why? Because you die when food is not available. This is not a trivial question, and we identified about $9 billion shortfall in terms of balance of payment coverage for this only. And now we are looking, of course, into the impact of energy on developing countries. But just to go to a point that you made, that the bank is also stepping up in climate, for which I congratulate the staff and you and everybody in the bank for taking that issue to heart. I want to be very clear on this. It is bad to have inflation, but we will survive as humanity. And it's very bad to have recessions. It would affect people horribly, especially poor people, but we can survive it as humanity. We cannot survive an unabated climate crisis. So mobilizing today for a more resilient tomorrow is exactly what we should do. We, as you know, we have stepped up at the fund. I want to thank for the support of bank staff to our new Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We made a promise that it would be operational in October, and David, I can tell our audience, we fulfilled this promise. We have 3 countries already with programs that would go to our board: Barbados, Costa Rica, and Rwanda. And we will write on your analytical work to bring policy reforms that would help countries be more resilient to climate shocks, and also to go to a low emission trajectory for the future. I want to ask you. We are in this week There would be intensive discussions. What does success of the meetings look like from your perspective?
Well, I think we have a lot of core symposiums and discussions. I'll be talking with Larry Summers at one to talk about the macro.
Great.
We have an energy conference. We have Ukraine, which is a very important meeting. On climate, there's a range, and I want to come back to that. And so, you know, I've been at the bank now 3.5 years. We've had record climate financing in each year, and we reached a big new record in 2022. That's our current fiscal year of $31.9 billion. So a
you can
giant
say 32
amount,
billion, about
32 billion, and which is not enough. Obviously, there needs to be a really big global effort. So I want to go through. I'm glad you raised the diagnostics. So we put a lot of focus on helping countries understand what they can and should be doing on both adaptation and mitigation. So that forms the global core diagnostic for climate change. So it's been a giant effort by the bank and intense focus by people on creating this. And you mentioned key countries of Rwanda and Costa Rica and Barbados, but we're doing big emitter countries such as Vietnam. They'll down the line, there'll be China. And these form then the basis for how the world can move forward. And I want to mention, the U.S. just last week has been strongly supportive of this effort and put nearly $1 billion, they have a specific number, into the Clean Technology Fund. So we welcome that. The World Bank has a lot of the key trust funds that are making available global resources into the climate space. We're launching right now one called SCALE, which is Sustainable Climate Action, that will be a major conduit for the world putting money into the climate space. Because one of the big challenges has been to have projects that are really impactful. We want to get results that we, the World Bank, and people are working all over the bank to actually identify the changes that are needed. So how do you close a coal-fired power plant in South Africa? Well, we're doing that and on down the list, but it takes huge amounts of money from the global community to do that. So we're setting up the mechanisms for that. Of course, everyone wants to move faster, but the reality is the World Bank can be the core of the programs that actually have impact, that actually make change.
One area where we ought to join forces is to make it so that more capital, as you said before, goes for climate action in emerging markets and developing economies. The numbers are staggering. Today, we spent as global community about $630 billion for climate adaptation and mitigation. But what the world needs is somewhere between $3 and $6 trillion. So we are not even close to this number. So how can we work together to make the policy reforms we support and your ability to focus on what works on the investment side, to move private money on scale to address the climate challenge? Because if emerging markets and developing countries do not bring their emission trajectory down, it doesn't really matter what advanced economies would achieve, because growth is expanding there in the emerging world. I see a huge opportunity for collaboration in that area. And actually, I see a chance throughout the meetings, David, for us to demonstrate that together we can better focus policies so they make a difference, and together we can get this duality of action, stabilize the world economy, and transform it for the future.
That's great, and I want to come back to the fragile country and the debt issues that you mentioned earlier. With regard to climate, there's a direct application of it. The World Bank can help by leveraging itself. So I'll give you a statistic. I don't know if you who know the bank very well may not know this one. $20.6 billion is the entire paid-in capital since the inception of the bank, and that's been leveraged into $820 billion through the leveraging process of IBRD. And then we're also doing that with IDA, which is our fund for the poorest. It borrows from international markets. So there's the direct aspect of what the bank can do, but that puts in perspective the entire life of the IBRD has had $820 billion of commitments, and you're mentioning the need for $1 trillion, and really some of the estimates are much higher for climate adaptation and mitigation. And so I think we need to really look for this second area, that the World Bank can do X, but then the rest of the world needs to be thinking in terms of doing 10X or 100X of what can be done. Our annual programs, for example, in important countries, Indonesia, are $2 billion, $3 billion, maybe $5 billion in program, when what they need, as Sri Mulyani pointed out in Glasgow, $280, $300 billion right up front in order to address coal.
And that can only come from public money opening space for private money on scale. It's not going to come from public finance. And this is why I think I'm very, very excited about thinking differently of how we deploy public money, how we measure the impact of public money. So it goes into the direction of what you said in the beginning of our conversation, to correct what today is primarily private finance going into the less risky part of the world, whereas where we need it the most is where the problems are most severe.
So we're looking for all ways to improve and expand resources. So we're doing actively now donor guarantees, where donor countries can guarantee World Bank lending, and that helps expand. We guarantee, the World Bank guarantees some projects, but a challenge in that area is to have the risk be fairly allocated between the lender, who is often from a wealthy country, and the development purpose that you're really putting. So we're working on those constantly, meeting frequently with the financial institutions of the advanced economies. I want to mention and ask your thoughts on, so the fragility problem is huge. The arms flow through North Africa hitting the Sahel is a giant challenge. Russia is often moving into the space. So we need to, I think, urgently find ways to put resources into these countries. That means from our two institutions, all the other world institutions that can add some to those totals. So that's a problem. And then the debt numbers are staggering. We're estimating in 2022, the IDA countries, the poorest countries, would have to put out $44 billion of their money. Some of it comes from our two institutions, to pay the creditors, almost all of whom live in wealthy countries. So I think we need to really have an urgent focus on reducing the unsustainable debt, so that we can get to a point where there's more fiscal space for all the other things we've talked about.
And that would be one of the topics that we would discuss thoroughly during the annual meetings. But discussions only take us that far. We need to have action that is at par with the size of the problem. And as you said, David, we are yet to get there. We have made some progress. You led the DSSI, we led it together. We now have some progress with the common framework, but in meanwhile, the problem is getting bigger and bigger, and we have to bring everybody around the table, private sector, the large bilaterals. China, of course, is among them, and then have resolution of that early, so countries can breathe and they can grow, and then service their debt obligations as a result.
Yeah, these are powerful.
Yep. And I can see that we should have another conversation at the end of the meetings and see how much we have achieved during this week.
Fabulous. Look forward to it.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Managing Director Georgieva and President Malpass, for the insightful and very informative discussion, which highlighted some of the major issues to expect in the coming week of the meetings. For all upcoming public and media events, please follow us on imf.org and all the IMF social media platforms. Thank you. Of the major issues to expect in the coming week of the meetings. For all upcoming public and media events, please follow us on IMF.
You've been watching live feeds from Washington, D.C., where the World Bank IMF annual meetings are holding. What we just saw is a joint seminar with the theme, The Way Forward, Addressing Multiple Crises in an Era of Volatility. And with us to discuss the main points is Arise business analyst, Bode Oshosami. Bode, thanks so much for joining us on Newsday. Now, what was the main message at this seminar just ended? Have we not heard all this before?
Well, what I just picked up, although this is just an introductory conversation which sets the tone for the entire conference, is that we are facing an impending recession, especially in 2023 and maybe the last quarter of 2022. And it's important that economies join forces, especially given the fact that there are going to be some fairly challenging situations, especially for the poorer economies, even as they begin to bear, I think, disproportionately more, a higher proportion of the pain that will come out of this recession. Debt level and rising rates is something that is going to be a big issue, especially a debt problem for emerging economies. Of course, inflation continues also to be very much on the agenda. 70% more people are going to go into poverty because of inflation, according to the data. And the other thing that was mentioned that was worrisome is capital. More capital is going to advanced economies. Even as advanced economies are creating debt at very high levels, central banks are investing more in bonds of advanced economies, and that is, of course, crowding out opportunity for less developed economies. The other thing, of course, is the issue of not just COVID, but the senseless wars, major disruption. We'll talk about some of that later. There's a slowdown. Eurozone is being hit by gas prices. China has been hit by COVID and the volatility of the housing sector. US is also losing momentum in terms of its growth, especially with higher interest rates. So the balancing of monetary and fiscal policies and ensuring that you are targeting support in a way that doesn't stoke inflation. These are some of the themes. But I think what I caught, something that we haven't heard as much before, and I hope it really means something, is joining forces in a meaningful way so that some countries are not left behind.
And but the emerging and developing economies, now they are in a different position, obviously, from the more developed economies. Now, how should they be responding to these multiple global crises that are happening back to back?
Well, I think it's important for them to understand that this crisis is here. This is not just something that they're talking about. And when you have a global crisis, it definitely has an impact on poorer economies, especially those that are heavily in debt. The higher dollar and higher interest rates, all this in an environment where capital is moving out of developing economies to developed economies, developing economies to developed economies, is going to be a problem. So this is at times requiring much more fiscal restraint in terms of ensuring that you don't misspend any fiscal space that you have. The other thing that I think is important, access to capital is going to be a big issue, especially as many of the global central banks and are investing in advanced economies, the bonds of advanced economies. Advanced economies are also creating debt at an alarming rate, almost crowding out opportunities for developing economies. I think that requires some sort of engagement, especially with advanced economies, to see how they can have access to capital in a way that, of course, is going to help them also develop, especially in these difficult times. So I think those are the main issues. They also spoke about well-targeted subsidies and ensuring that you don't use subsidies in a way that stokes more inflation or in a way that is not as efficient as it needs to be. I think that's another lesson for developing economies where, of course, subsidies are absolutely critical just to reduce some of the pain associated with the distortions we see in the environment.
Well, but as this meeting goes on, a lot is also happening globally. Russia is attacking Ukraine, OPEC Plus is seen as the bad boy, and the US, they're introducing tougher measures to paralyze Chinese access to chips. Now, did the seminar postulate any thoughts on the increasingly sharp divide between East and West, now seen as the economic war?
Well, I caught the phrase, the senseless wars, and senseless wars means conflicts that just don't add any value. And it's not just Russia, Ukraine. I think there are lots of conflicts between China and the US over chips and over resources. The economic war is perhaps even more serious than the actual physical war. OPEC Plus is now seen as the bad boy, even though I think the world is probably overreacting to the decision they made to cut the quotas. But just recently, IMF disbursed 1.3 billion under the food shock window for Ukraine to help them handle their balance of payments. All these payments would not have been necessary if there had been no war. So you are also crowding out monies or aid that would have been available for much more constructive purposes. But clearly, I think we haven't heard as much from the IMF, especially in dealing with some of the tensions between countries, China and the US, of course, Russia and the rest of the world. And we are now seeing this East-West divide. So it wasn't really mentioned so much in this introductory conversation, but I think certainly it will come up at some stage that this economic war, has costs, and some of these wars are really senseless, and there's probably a need to work out some way to achieve a win-win or some kind of compromise that will take the world, put the world in a much more positive situation.
All right. Well, thank you, Bode, for your analysis, as always.